The roar came first, a sound so sharp, so powerful, it shook the windows of Ouagadougou. Men, women, and children looked to the sky as shadows swept across the streets. Above them, Su-35 fighter jets machines once reserved only for superpowers cut through the Sahel clouds. But this time, something was different. These jets weren't just moving on Moscow's orders, they were responding to a command that came from the heart of Africa itself, from Captain Ibrahim Traoré. For decades, Africa was told it could not command such symbols of power. Nations like Burkina Faso were expected to remain dependent, to accept outdated equipment, while the West and its allies kept the most advanced technology for themselves. But now, in 2025, the world is forced to ask, how did a young leader from one of Africa's poorest nations come to hold authority over some of Russia's most advanced aircraft? This is not just a military spectacle. It is a signal, a message that reverberates far beyond the runways of West Africa. Every takeoff, every maneuver of those Su-35s sends a shockwave through Washington, Paris, London, and beyond. Western analysts whisper about a new Cold War in Africa. African citizens cheer about sovereignty and pride, and the balance of power trembles in ways we have not seen since the 20th century. Brothers and sisters, this moment is more than news. It is history unfolding in real time. The world is watching Africa now, not with pity, but with respect and fear. Do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré is steering Africa toward true independence, or is the danger of foreign entanglement still too great? Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to witness this turning point for Africa. And subscribe if you believe that the truth, not headlines, should guide how we understand Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso, and the future of Africa. The morning it happened, there was no warning siren, no official parade. Just the sudden roar of engines igniting on a runway in West Africa. The Su-35, one of Russia's most advanced fighter aircraft capable of outmaneuvering nearly anything the West could put in the sky, was no longer a distant rumor. It was here in Burkina Faso. And more astonishingly, its movement was tied not to the Kremlin, but to the commands of President Ibrahim Traoré. For years, Burkina Faso had been seen as a landlocked nation struggling against poverty, terrorism, and political instability. Its military was known for light infantry, outdated Soviet rifles, and pickup trucks retrofitted with machine guns. To suddenly see a fleet of Su-35's aircraft valued at over $85 million each lifting off the tarmac was a shock, not just to the Burkina Faso people, but to the global security establishment. These jets weren't just parked as a gesture. They were flying, maneuvering, and demonstrating power under Traoré's direction. To understand the weight of this moment, you must picture the Su-35 itself. Twin engines screaming with thrust vectoring, allowing it to flip and twist mid-air in ways that seem to defy physics. It carries radar systems so advanced that NATO commanders have spent years developing countermeasures. Armed with missiles capable of striking both air and ground targets, it is not merely an aircraft, it is a flying statement of dominance. And now, instead of serving as a symbol of Moscow's reach, it was tied to the sovereignty of Burkina Faso. Eyewitnesses in Ouagadougou describe the scene with awe. Mothers pulling their children from school so they could watch from rooftops. Vendors in the market dropping their baskets to run outside as the thunder passed overhead. Young men waving flags of Burkina Faso, shouting Traoré's name as if he were not only a president, but a commander in the sky. The pride was palpable, and for once the people felt that military power was not being used to suppress them, but to defend them. Yet the symbolism cut deeper. Just 2 years earlier, Burkina Faso had expelled French troops and ended decades of military dependency on the West. Critics said the country would be left defenseless, a pawn on the chessboard of global powers. But the image of Su-35s under Traoré's orders shattered that narrative. It sent a message: Burkina Faso was no longer a client state waiting for foreign protection. It was a nation capable of writing its own rules. Diplomatic insiders suggest the planes may have come through discreet channels, perhaps redirected from contracts once intended for other nations. Russia, pressured by sanctions and seeking to demonstrate global partnerships, found in Traoré a willing and bold partner. But while Moscow supplied the hardware, it was Traoré's political will that transformed it into more than a transaction. He took what could have been just another deal and turned it into a performance of sovereignty. Western media quickly seized on the story. Headlines in Paris questioned whether Africa was becoming a new front in East-West rivalry. Washington think tanks issued reports warning that advanced Russian aircraft in the Sahel could destabilize NATO's influence in North Africa. And yet on the ground in Burkina Faso, the reaction was entirely different. For ordinary citizens, this was not about Moscow or Washington. It was about dignity, the belief that their country too could wield power once reserved for others. The sight of those Su-35s moving under African command marked a rupture in history. It was more than an arms deal, more than a military exercise. It was the visual proof that a young African leader dismissed by many as too inexperienced could take the tools of great powers and bend them to the will of his own people. For the first time in living memory, the balance of the skies above West Africa no longer belonged solely to outsiders. And so the event left a question hanging in the air. If Ibrahim Traoré could command Su-35s today, what might he command tomorrow? Tanks, satellites, or perhaps even the direction of Africa's political future? The climax came not when the Su-35s were rolled out onto the runway, but when they lifted into the sky. Cameras from international broadcasters zoomed in as the jets climbed almost vertically, engines screaming before cutting across the Sahel sky in maneuvers that seemed almost impossible. The message was unmistakable. This was not a ceremonial display. This was a demonstration of power. For the people of Burkina Faso, the moment was electric. Crowds gathered along roadsides and rooftops, waving flags, some chanting prayers of gratitude, others shouting Traoré's name. Elderly veterans who once fought with rusty Kalashnikovs now watched with tears in their eyes as their nation's flag seemed to rise alongside these symbols of modern strength. For decades, Burkina Faso had been portrayed as weak, dependent, a pawn in other people's wars. That day, it was no longer just a small country in the Sahel, it was a nation capable of commanding the skies. The emotional charge spread beyond the borders. In Mali and Niger, members of the Alliance of Sahel States shared videos on social media framing the event as a victory for all three nations. If one rises, we all rise. One Malian soldier posted showing footage of the jets carving patterns in the air. Youth movements in West Africa circulated hashtags celebrating African sovereignty, while online commentators across the continent declared that history had shifted. But outside of Africa, the reaction was very different. Western media outlets moved quickly. CNN cut into its programming with a live panel asking, "Is Russia building an airbase in Africa?" French commentators described it as an alarming provocation. In Washington, defense analysts scrambled to understand the scope of the deployment. Were these jets permanently stationed in Burkina Faso? Were Russian pilots still at the controls, or had Burkinabe officers been trained to fly them? The uncertainty amplified the drama. Reports circulated that NATO military satellites had been repositioned to monitor the airfields of Burkina Faso. The Pentagon quietly issued a statement of concern over destabilizing arms transfers. French politicians accused Traoré of endangering regional stability, hinting at new sanctions. The European press was full of speculation. Was this a one-time show or the start of a new military doctrine for Africa? Meanwhile, Russia's reaction was deliberately muted. Officials in Moscow released carefully worded statements about partnership and support for allies in the fight against terrorism. But Russian state media did not hold back. Broadcasters celebrated Traoré as a courageous leader, standing up to the West, positioning Burkina Faso as a front line of multipolar resistance. Footage of the Su-35s flying over Ouagadougou aired repeatedly, framed as proof that Moscow's friends would never stand alone. Within Burkina Faso, the symbolism struck at the heart of the people. Families spoke with pride about telling their children they had seen the day their skies belonged to them. University students debated whether this meant their country could finally resist Western interference. Even those skeptical of Traoré's leadership admitted that the sight of advanced jets under African command was breathtaking. Yet, there was also fear. In hushed tones, some worried about retaliation. Would the West now cut off aid? Would sanctions bring hardship on ordinary people? Was the pride of the moment worth the risks that might follow? These questions lingered even as celebrations filled the streets. The climax of that day was not just mechanical, not just the roar of engines or the sight of steel wings slicing the horizon. It was emotional. It was political. It was the collision of history with the present, of Africa's long struggle for dignity with the reality of modern geopolitics. The world watched as Ibrahim Traoré stood at the center of it, his image now forever linked to the sight of Su-35s obeying his command. And in that instant, a line was crossed. The Sahel was no longer just a theater of poverty and insurgency. It had become a stage where great powers and a rising Africa played out a drama that would ripple into every capital from Paris to Washington to Moscow. The roar of the Su-35s eventually faded from the skies, but their echo lingered in the streets, in the markets, and in the political halls of Burkina Faso. What had begun as a military display quickly transformed into a chain reaction of civil and political consequences that no one could ignore. Inside Burkina Faso, the immediate effect was a surge of national pride. In Ouagadougou, young people painted murals of jets streaking across the sky alongside the face of Ibrahim Traoré. For many, these images symbolized more than aircraft. They represented dignity restored. The poorest citizens, who often felt abandoned by history, now spoke of belonging to a nation capable of commanding the tools of the powerful. Parents told their children that they no longer had to look up to Paris or Washington for protection. They could look to their own flag. This pride, however, was not simply emotional. It carried real political weight. Traoré's government, once criticized for postponing elections and consolidating power, suddenly appeared in a different light. His critics found it harder to paint him as merely another military ruler. By commanding advanced technology, he had altered the narrative. He was no longer just surviving coups and insurgencies, but actively reshaping the balance of power. His approval ratings surged, and rallies in support of his leadership drew thousands. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso's politics were not dominated by despair, but by a sense of possibility. At the same time, opposition figures and civil society leaders voiced unease. They asked whether relying on Russian jets truly meant independence, or if it was simply exchanging one form of dependency for another. Intellectuals debated openly: was Traoré's boldness sustainable, or would it provoke isolation from the very international community that still controlled financial aid and trade lifelines? These debates did not diminish the pride, but they introduced a sober undercurrent, a recognition that symbolism alone could not shield a nation from economic realities. In the countryside, reactions were layered with complexity. Farmers and villagers, often far removed from geopolitical calculations, expressed both excitement and worry. Some saw the jets as guardians against the insurgent groups that had terrorized their homes for years. Others feared retaliation, that extremists emboldened by Western disapproval might escalate their attacks to punish communities seen as aligned with Traoré's vision. Local leaders urged vigilance, balancing celebration with caution. Politically, the demonstration of Su-35s had ripple effects across the Sahel. Mali and Niger, already partners in the alliance of Sahel states, embraced the display as a collective victory. Leaders in Bamako and Niamey praised Traoré for showing that Africa could wield advanced technology on its own terms. Quietly, discussions accelerated about joint military exercises, shared defense strategies, and perhaps even a common air defense system. The idea of a united Sahel, long dismissed as impractical, began to take on new urgency. But with every wave of pride came counterwaves of concern. Western governments moved swiftly to reassess their ties with Burkina Faso. Rumors of sanctions surfaced in Brussels and Washington. France considered tightening restrictions on financial transfers. Aid organizations worried that their operations might be targeted by suspicion, viewed as channels for foreign interference. Diplomats whispered that Burkina Faso could soon face the same isolation once imposed on nations that crossed Western red lines. Still, in the eyes of ordinary citizens, these risks seemed secondary to the thrill of reclaiming agency. Civil society groups began organizing forums titled "Our Skies, Our Future," where students, activists, and community elders debated what national sovereignty should look like in practice. Instead of fear, there was an energy, a determination to translate symbolic victory into lasting reforms. The political class, once fractured, now faced a choice: either align with Traoré's vision of an independent Burkina Faso standing proudly on the world stage, or risk being swept aside by the tide of public sentiment. For better or worse, the Su-35s had redrawn the political map. In the end, the jets were more than machines of war. They were catalysts, stirring not only national pride, but also the urgent question of what kind of society Burkina Faso wanted to become. And in that question lay both the hope of renewal and the shadow of conflict yet to come. In Washington, the sound of Su-35 engines over Burkina Faso was not heard directly, but it reverberated through the corridors of power. Analysts at the Pentagon and the State Department pored over satellite images, intelligence cables, and video clips spreading online. What unsettled them was not just the presence of Russian aircraft in Africa, it was the symbolism of who appeared to be giving the orders. For decades, American policymakers assumed Africa's skies would remain under Western oversight. The idea that Ibrahim Traoré, a 36-year-old captain turned head of state, could direct such advanced weapons challenged those assumptions at their core. The U.S. response was cautious but layered with alarm. Officials spoke publicly of concern over destabilizing arms transfers. Privately, think tanks warned that this development could signal a strategic realignment of Africa, pulling nations closer to Russia and further from NATO's orbit. Some voices in Congress pushed for sanctions, while others urged engagement to prevent Traoré from slipping fully into Moscow's embrace. What united them all was a sense of unease. The rules of the old order no longer seemed guaranteed. In Europe, the tone was sharper. French commentators described the flights as a humiliation given Burkina Faso's recent expulsion of French troops. Newspapers in Paris questioned whether West Africa was slipping from Europe's influence entirely. In Brussels, EU diplomats debated targeted economic measures. Yet, even as they warned of danger, they admitted the difficulty of regaining ground lost to Moscow's careful diplomacy and Traoré's rising popularity. Russia, meanwhile, was deliberate in shaping the narrative. Moscow presented the event as proof that its partnerships extended beyond Ukraine or the Middle East. Russian media highlighted Traoré as a symbol of courage, framing him as the face of a multipolar world. By allowing African leadership to visibly command advanced jets, Russia positioned itself not only as an arms supplier, but as a partner in sovereignty, a contrast to Western portrayals of Africa as perpetually dependent. China watched with quiet calculation. Though not directly involved, Beijing's strategists saw opportunity. If Africa could diversify its partnerships, China could expand its role as an economic and technological partner, leaving military symbolism to Russia. For Beijing, a more independent Africa was not a threat but a potential ally in rebalancing global influence away from Washington. Across Africa, the reactions were deeply emotional. In Ghana, South Africa, and Nigeria, debates ignited in parliaments and media outlets. Some leaders warned that aligning with Russia risked drawing the continent into new conflicts. Others argued that Burkina Faso had struck a blow for dignity that should inspire all of Africa. Among young people, especially on social media, the mood leaned toward celebration. Memes of Su-35s decorated with African flags spread quickly alongside hashtags declaring a new era of sovereignty. For the global South, from Latin America to the Middle East, the spectacle was read through the lens of resistance. Commentators in Venezuela and Iran praised Traoré's defiance of Western dominance. Palestinian activists compared Burkina Faso's assertion of independence to their own struggles. The symbolism resonated far beyond Africa's borders, weaving into broader narratives of challenging old empires. And yet the reaction that mattered most was perhaps the quiet one: ordinary Americans, many of them veterans of past wars, asking why Africa had become another arena of great power rivalry. Was this about security or about resources? Was Washington prepared to respect Africa's right to chart its own destiny? Or would it repeat the patterns of intervention that history had shown to be so costly? From Washington to Moscow, Paris to Beijing, one truth became clear: Ibrahim Traoré had forced the world to watch Africa not as an afterthought, but as a stage where the balance of global power was now being contested. The thunder of the Su-35s has long faded, but the questions they left behind still hang heavy in the air. Was this display a promise of protection for the people of Burkina Faso, or a warning shot to the powers that have long dictated Africa's destiny? For every child who watched those jets with pride, there is also a farmer who wonders if sanctions will soon make food and medicine harder to find. Pride and peril now walk side by side. What we know for certain is this: the world cannot look away. Washington, Paris, and Brussels may see this moment as provocation. Moscow may celebrate it as partnership. But for Africa, and especially for Burkina Faso, this was a declaration that sovereignty is no longer negotiable. Whether that declaration leads to renewal or to conflict depends on choices yet to be made. For older generations of Americans watching, it may feel like echoes of the Cold War are resurfacing in new and unfamiliar places. But perhaps the more important lesson is that Africa is no longer the silent backdrop of history. Under leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, it has stepped into the spotlight, demanding to be heard and respected. So I leave you with this question: can we continue to trust President Ibrahim Traoré to steer Africa toward independence without repeating the mistakes of the past? Or will his boldness invite dangers that the continent is not yet ready to bear? Please share this video if you feel that you are one of the first to witness this historic shift. And subscribe if you believe that the truth, not the headlines, must guide how we understand Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso, and the future of Africa. Because history is being written before our eyes, and Africa is holding the pen.